Hello and welcome once again to Screenworks. I'm John Riarte, curator of digital programs at the Photographers Gallery in London. Screenworks is a collaborative program of live streams initiated by the Fotomuseum Winterthur in Switzerland and the Photographers Gallery in London. Screenworks is a series of fortnightly stream events in which artists, researchers, curators, and practitioners are invited to share their screen and take the audience through guided explorations of their work. We started this program in April 2020 to continue the investigation that both the Photographers Gallery and Fotomuseum Winterthur has been doing on the changing notion of photography on its digital and network form. If this is your first Screenwork, please check our archive on screenworks.com on our YouTube channel to find out about our previous events. Now, for those of you on Zoom, your microphone should be muted. If that's not the case, please mute it now. And the event will be recorded and will be archived. So please turn off your camera if you don't want to be recorded. Please use the public chat to ask your questions, or alternatively, send a private message to Marco or to myself.
And hello from me too. My name is Marco De Mutis. I'm digital curator at Fotomuseum Winterthur. Today, we are looking up at the sky. Previously, we have explored the images on our screen that come from distant satellites above and materialize through DIY antennas, as well as corporate systems like Google Earth. But today, we invert this perspective. So we'll be taken on a peculiar tour of the sky as seen from a camera that sits on the rooftop of Luke Berndt's house in Washington, DC. Not only will we invert the trajectory of the gaze that surveil our planet, but we'll see how Berndt created SkyBot, an autonomous system that captures images of the planes that fly above his house in real time, with information of flights, movements, and plane ownership. His automated camera system creates a catalog and an archive of the constant stream of aircraft flying overhead, but also investigates who owns and occupies the space above our heads. SkyBot reminds us that cameras, satellites, algorithms, and information can be reappropriated to create our own tools to gain knowledge of what happens in the sky. In this screen walk, which will also be slightly a technical tutorial, but also an invitation for anyone to build their own SkyBot systems, Berndt will also show us how planes reveal much more of our interconnected skies on a social, economic, and political level. From military aircraft to private air travel, the traffic in the sky tells us something about the different interests and needs that regulate the movements in the sky, which usually remain largely unnoticed and invisible from the naked eye. Luke Berndt is based in Washington, DC, where he's constantly tinkering on projects. He enjoys finding new ways to connect different disciplines together. Dear Luke, thanks so much for being here with us today. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much. So that was a great introduction, and this will be hopefully an interesting talk. We'll be covering a lot of different topics, definitely some technical aspects, but I think also just some interesting research or topic prompts for people who may want to dig a bit deeper. And I'm trying to put as many links in as possible. So if you want to go dig into some of these areas after this talk, hopefully you'll have some information to do that. But definitely feel free to reach out to me, and I can point you in the right direction if you want to go down any of these rabbit holes, and there will be a lot. So let me go dive in, and please send in chats. I will try to keep an eye on the chat, but if folks are able just to jump in and ask them to, in case I miss any real interesting ones. Cool. So let me start. So I did put together a presentation, but don't get too scared. It's mostly pictures and other fun things like that. And I'm going to try switching between the presentation and then also just showing you some of the code I've written and along with the actual websites I've been using or some of the data feeds, so you can get a live example of stuff that's coming in. It might end on a bit of a tragic note. I'll show you where SkyBot is these days and where it may have gone wrong. But lead off with the tagline. This is my adventure in autonomous aviation photography. It all really kicked off during pandemic when we were sort of just stuck around the house. And years earlier, I just put together, we had I found it my job, just an old security camera that was being discarded. And I had been looking at how I could track aircraft, and I thought, hey, why don't I try pointing the camera and have it follow aircraft as they go by? It worked, but barely. But in my new free time, during pandemic, I took up that project. And since I had missed flying around, this is a great opportunity to see from a different perspective, as opposed to flying and seeing the ground beneath me, being able to be stuck inside and watch all the planes above me. Let me share. Let me go into presentation mode. I'll switch back and forth from this and go back and forth in that. So just going to walk a little bit on how these airplanes locations are being found and shared, a little bit about like where you are and how that actually matters, and some stuff on that. Actually photographing the airplane, I'll spend a bit of time on that, just because security cameras aren't really designed to take great photos. So there's some hacks, and you have to think about it from that perspective, and seeing how you can sort of tweak that to get a better photo. And then the overall pipeline that goes from all this raw corpus of images, and how to actually sort of the autonomous process for actually getting that up on the internet and doing a little automatic curation using ML to make sure we're only sharing pictures of airplanes. And finally, just going all in and running and turning how to take these images and turn them into sketch and other types of sort of derivative artwork from this. So it's going to be all over the place. There'll be plenty to dive into later. So let me just get started with some of the basic technology. So all of this is based upon this technology called, it's just Adsb, which stands for Atomic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. Basically, this is a way for aircraft to sort of broadcast their location, where they're heading, to give better situational awareness for the air traffic controllers to say, you can stay on these routes. It's more accurate than radar. And also for the aircraft themselves to know there's an airplane coming this way, and you can do some automated collision detection. So it's sort of the wave of the future. It's mandated for most civil aviation globally. So this is being used on aircraft around the world. This doesn't just work in the US. However, in the US, you don't get all of the federal or Department of Defense, the military aircraft. They sometimes have it on, they sometimes have it off. They sometimes play games with it, and can set funny messages for what their call sign is. So it's you get an interesting mix in here, and there's a lot of people get into who use this as a data source and can look at some of the clues to piece together some interesting tales from this, especially around the federal aircraft. And for the radio nerds, this happens around 1.09 megahertz. So there's one frequency used for most jets and things like that, and then there's another one used a little differently for sort of the Cessnas and these little propeller planes. So it works around a wide range of aircraft. So this is sort of an example of one of the many websites out there that pulls in this information and puts up on a nice map and makes it really accessible. So this is Flight Radar 24. So let me pull this up. And so this is an example of all the aircraft right now, right near my house. And you can keep zooming in, and then you can click on one of the aircraft and it has where it is, and then it pulls in a database to find out sort of interesting information about it. So this is like just a great example of how you can sort of visualize and look at this data. What I was working with was more ones and zeros and some very raw information. So we'll get a bit more into this, but this is a very accessible thing you can start looking at and going to and checking out. So encourage people just to easily dip their toe in the water with this. But if we go back here, there are a few gotchas. So you notice that in some cases, what you'll notice is, even though the data is being broadcast, some of the websites like Flight Radar 24, or there's another one called Flight Aware, don't actually display this data. They actively filter it out, which sometimes means you're missing some of the really interesting stuff, which is part of the reason I ran my own sort of receiver, so I could directly pull in this information versus relying on someone else. There is one website, I'll just show people, called Adsb Exchange. And they sort of pride themselves on not doing any sort of filtering. They've set it up so they'll pass along all of the data they get directly to you, and it encourages a lot of people to contribute. So you'll get more of the interesting aircraft if you do this. But at the end, if it's something local, like what I was doing, having your own receiver and setting that up is easy to do. And I'll get more into how you do that and probably worth doing. But so all of this data right now for these, the websites I was showing you is collected through crowdsourcing, which is really interesting. This map here shows all of the different people actively contributing a data feed into a website called FlightAware. And that's probably one of the larger websites is FlightAware. And you do it by just taking a Raspberry Pi, which is a cheap $25 single board computer, and hooking up, I'll get into this a little bit, but it's what's called a software-defined radio. And it lets you capture some of these types of signals. So it's something that's pretty easy to put out there. And if everyone sort of works together, you get to have sort of these amazing data source that gives you sort of like a global view of what's happening. I won't dive into too much on this, but this is also a really interesting hack where there's sort of an older type of identifier called mode S. And that really is, just think about it as your sort of like friend or foe identifier. And it only broadcasts what your identification is, but it doesn't broadcast where you are. But if you have enough people working together in sort of this crowdsourced model, you're able to sort of look at, what second, the time it comes in at. So you'll see around in an area, different people receiving the signal at different times. And using that, they can actually figure out where that aircraft is coming from or is broadcasting from in its location. So that's an interesting way to sort of back to those sort of dark aircraft that may only be broadcasting on mode S. This is a way that sort of through crowdsourcing, people are working together to help highlight and figure out where some of these aircraft are in the sky, even if they're not sending out their location. So just one of those interesting examples of sort of the power of the crowd there. Yeah, this is the nerdy details on this, but again, you're just sending back not your location, but your identification. And with that alone, people are able to triangulate where that signal is coming from. So as you can see, this is a really interesting source of data, and people are doing some fun things with this. So one of the areas is in data journalism. This was back in like 2016 or so. This was one of the first examples of this. Someone brought sort of this Adsb setup, again, this is just a laptop and sort of a cheap receiver out to Davos, and was tracking where all of the, elite essentially were flying in with the private jets and helicopters, and sort of piecing together who was attending and sort of different companies who may be sending people and how they were traveling there, just from this source of information alone. And I don't have a link for it. She'll put it in too. There was another example of people actually tracking dictators as they flew around, because they have, these private aircraft, and sort of tracking the travel of different dictators as they went around through, different ports and different cities around the world. So, in this day and age, when you start thinking about, there's the interest in tracking oligarchs' yachts, similar thing too. You could start looking at how sort of this rich, maybe people with ill-gotten gains are sort of traveling in what circles and who they associate with, just by looking at the aircraft they travel in. This was another great example. So I sort of have a soft spot in my heart for Twitter bots. This is a great Twitter bot. It's made, and I actually forget his real name, by his Twitter handle is Lemon Odor. He's a Disney Imagineer. And during the pandemic, he lives in LA. He was noticing lots of aircrafts having weird flight patterns. So he set up a Twitter bot that looks for weird flight patterns. So if it notices like a circular pattern or a very regular pattern, where in many cases in LA, it's a news helicopter circling some sort of crime scene, but there's lots of other interesting examples too, where it's someone, flying the aerial survey routes they do to actually take pictures of the city, so you get those nice Google Map images and things like that. So you sort of pick out what are these abnormal flights, and then it broadcasts, I've detected this, and sends you a link for all of that. And of course, back to this, there's a lot of interest too in, while you don't always capture military aircraft, and many times, they're not broadcasting, especially if they're doing anything, in sort of like a real threat environment. They're not going to broadcast their location, but you do end up noticing lots of times when aircraft maybe are in transit, or if they're just shuttling things around, and you can sometimes infer, certain things. If this is like back to this, like I think a C-17 is more like a supply plane. You can sort of notice it's flying from here to here. So from sort of like the supply and logistics side, you can start to pick up probably some interesting tidbits. And it also, you just sort of notice maybe when there's like just unusual aircrafts in unusual places. So it's probably not as a sort of armchair military person, you're probably not going to gain much in, some sort of intelligence things. But for people who like tracking weird airplanes, there's a very interesting niche here, and pretty active community. But this probably is my favorite one today, mostly because it's just gotten a little bit of press. But this is someone, again, you can notice they're using Adsb Exchange, which doesn't allow for airplane owners to filter any of the data. And what it does is it just tracks Elon Musk's private jets and where he's flying around to. And well, that's interesting. What was more interesting is sort of the Barbra Streisand effect of Elon Musk tried to have this shut down, and actively offered, I think, to pay the owner of this Twitter bot like some exorbitant fund to take down this Twitter bot. So it's also maybe just an interesting, way to shed sunlight on, wealthy people as they jet around, and also sort of brings into sort of that question of what is the public sphere, what information should be public, what is your right to privacy, should the air and the way you travel in it be a private sphere, or is that more of a public sphere? And what sign, this information is being used in theory really more for preventing aircraft crashes and making sure people can drive around. Is this something that should be fully public or not? So it raises very interesting questions in a very fun manner, and also got Elon Musk pissed off. So there's just so much goodness in this one. But so that's a bit on Adsb. So that's, where the information on where aircraft are. I'm going to talk just really quickly, and this is my nerd area of passion, so I'll make sure I don't spend too much time on it, but how I actually receive these signals and sort of the technology there. Because this is something that is pretty accessible. So I encourage you to start dabbling in software-defined radios. There are really just a bit of hardware that converts radio signals into data that you can just use a software program to process. So instead of having, a dedicated, actually I have one lying around, like a dedicated walkie-talkie, and it does only one thing, and it works on only these, 4 frequencies, what you end up with is something that you can just switch around with a little bit of software and receive signals. In most of them, they all report receiving signals, and in more of the fancy ones also report sending signals. But for this case, I was just using this cheap, less than $50 radio there. It's called, they're called like RTL SDR. And the interesting thing is they actually started out being used as TV receivers, the DVB receivers in Europe. And it found out that they actually work great as software-defined radios. They're actually more flexible. But you can start paying more and more money, and they do more and more complex stuff. But for this sort of thing, $50 is great. However, I would say, just going down other rabbit holes, there's other really interesting wireless signals out there. And they could be interesting for, queuing up photography, or just for other interesting data sources as you start to look at, what information floating around and through the air. So, I think one interesting, I'll just footnote this as, if you want to start building some interesting projects, ships also broadcast a similar signal that gives off their location. It's called AIS. I'm not near the ocean, so this is not a project, luckily, that I can dive into because I don't need more projects. But if you are near the ocean or major waterway, this could be a really interesting way to sort of take this exact same technology or approach and give that a try. So if you wanted to get this running, there's some programs you just run on your laptop that work with that software-defined radio. And this is what I was doing with my Raspberry Pi. And this is an example of sort of the interface you get here. Since it's only pulling in local aircraft, you don't have as much information because you get maybe a surprising amount of range. You get about 100 miles or so from some pretty simple antennas. But the flip side is, you can't see what's happening in California. You only see what's, sort of in a radius around you. The program called Dump 1090, which is a horrible name, but back to that 1090 megahertz, it's sort of based upon that. And it's just a simple little program. And most of the ones out there are sort of based upon that. And I was running this in a Docker container on my laptop, on the Raspberry Pi, and it was pretty easy to get up and running. So that's a bit on how I got the signals. And this is a fun rabbit hole I promise only to briefly get into, but it also turns out that a lot of this information about the aircraft is also publicly accessible. And it depends upon where the aircraft is registered, on how easy it is to get to it, and how good that data is. But since I'm in the US and I was working mostly with US registered aircraft flying overhead, I'll get into some of the exceptions. I was able to pull up most of the aircraft flying over me and look it up inside the FAA data, which the FAA just publishes and puts out there. It gives you a lot of interesting information. You get the aircraft manufacturer, sort of the model and type. So that's your Boeing 737 or something like that, how many engines it has. But then also the registrant's name and address. So this is the person on record associated with that aircraft. And this is where it gets into sort of like interesting ways you can sort of pivot into more information. Interestingly enough, this is often not the operator of the aircraft. So often you'll have like United's leasing it from some bank or company, or I'll get into the next slide. There's other weird like shell companies essentially, and they're not often nefarious, but they're funny. So the FAA data, though, doesn't cover any government aircraft or international or military aircraft. So you sort of have like a subset where some of the more interesting stuff actually isn't in this data. But the plus side, the data is it's great. The data quality is fantastic because the FAA makes sure you fill this out really well. But there's also open source aircraft data. Oh, I forgot the link. It's Open Skies, maybe .net. And it's sort of like a crowdsourced data set, and they collect also from other international sources. So this will get you some of those weird government airplanes. It'll also get you all of like Lufthansa's aircraft. The trade-off is that the data quality is not as good because it's crowdsourced or coming from different data sources. Some people say Boeing Company or Boeing, and like the actual model numbers get weird. So if you're going to do like data science stuff on this, you're going to have to do a bit of work. But if you put them together, you get a pretty complete way of pulling in, essentially looking up a lookup table on all the aircraft flying above you and being able to associate with this with a photo. So back to the naming of things. It turns out, there's a lot of boring ones, and these are sort of to be expected. You'll get the major aircraft directly own and register almost all their aircraft. So, those are sort of boring and predictable, but you'll also notice a lot of fun ones. There's a bunch of aircraft trusts, and I'll get into that in a second, what that is. But you also notice there's a lot of LLCs. And it almost has turned out to be like when you get a boat, you give it a fun boat name. It sort of seems like there's a lot of people getting private jets and giving them fun private jet LLCs associated with all the jets. And I dug into it a little bit. It looks like a lot of the LLCs are set up for sort of liability protection. So if you lend your jet to someone else, someone's flying on it, something happens, you're not personally liable. It's the company. But it still seems like people like to have a lot of fun with that. So the aircraft trust I thought at first, I saw lots of them. I thought there was something weird and nefarious. It turns out, though, that if you're just not a US citizen, or your company's board aren't all US citizens, then you can just form a trust and put your aircraft in that. So, as you go into SkyBot, you'll notice all these different aircraft trusts owning the jets. It turns out it's really more boring and procedural. But just to give an example of what you can do with some of these LLCs, so this was one that caught my eye because it's called Meatball Martini, which is gross and, it's a horrible name. But there's a website called, I think it's Open Corporate, and you can actually go in and look up the different LLCs. So it turns out Meatball Martini Airlines is part of Meatball Martini LLC, which turns out they have lots of different LLCs also associated with Meatball Martini, such as Dogs, Meatball Martini Nantucket, and Meatball Martini ice cream has to be my favorite because that's just horrible. And then when you look up their address, it looks like it's just some random mailbox in the middle of a field. So this is a rabbit hole that someone should totally go down, is just looking and cataloging all of these private jets flying overhead, photographing them, and then sort of doing just, with a little bit of automation, pulling up all of the corporate stuff associated with them, because every now and then you find some really weird stuff like this. And again, this is probably nothing nefarious. It's probably someone just having a lot of fun and really knows how to create LLCs, but you just end up with weird things like that. So that's a bit about how I got the information, pulled it in, a little bit about the data there. Let's actually get to some photography. And this is where it gets a little tricky. And I'll get you a little bit more about how you actually position the camera and point it in the right direction, because that ends up being the hardest part of this entire thing. So the very high level, what I'm doing is I'm taking the plane's longitude and latitude, and think just on a map, that's sort of like the lines going horizontal and the lines going vertically. And then also the plane's altitude. So this sort of gives you where in the world is the plane. I have the same thing for my camera. And for the most part, it's not moving. So I can just, use my phone, look up where my GPS coordinates are, and then use my phone too and get the altitude. And from that, you can do a little bit of math, which I had to look up on the internet because I'm not that good at math. But I found the right math to essentially figure out where to point the camera, the azimuth, and then also the elevation, sort of where to aim it. And if you do that fast enough, you can have the camera follow where the plane is. So just to give an example, so for the azimuth, you can get if you get the longitude, latitude for the camera, and you get the longitude and the latitude for the airplane, you can just do math and figure out where it is relative to you, and you get this in degrees. So the same thing for the elevation. You get the difference in altitudes, and then from that, you're able to figure out what the elevation is. If you do more math, you can put this all together and get the distance of how far the plane is away from you. We'll get into focusing. That still remains the bane of my existence, is how to actually properly focus the camera. But for the most part, it's infinite, because it's beyond sort of like that focal distance. It's in the infinite zone, because you're talking for the most part like 10 kilometers away or something more than that. So of course that all seems nice on the PowerPoint slide. Where it got really tricky is you don't get the location updates all that frequently for how fast a plane's traveling, especially if the plane's close to you. You get them every 1 to 2 seconds. The altitude updates are less frequent. And while this wasn't a huge issue while I was taking photos from my house and the planes were 10 kilometers away, we did try setting this up with some of my friends. We set this up near an airport where the planes are, I don't know, 200 meters away from you and moving really fast relative to you. So you, in 5 seconds, it will be out of frame if you're trying to zoom in a lot. So if you're trying to capture something a lot closer, you have to really pay attention to some of this. So this is where you can sort of do some interpolation. You get where the plane is headed, you get how fast it's traveling, and from that you can sort of figure out, like, I knew where you were half a second ago, I can sort of figure out where it would be a second from now. And this is also pretty helpful because it does take a while for these cameras to move around and to also, actually slap the photo and then pull the photo back. So some of those things can take a little bit of time. So sometimes you're going to want to lead the camera. And just one other fun note is, it turns out this is something that really got us confused. The Earth is not a circle, and different GPS systems handle this differently. So it ends up that the way altitude is reported ends up being a bit different. So what messed us up for probably a month or so while I was working on this was the consumer GPS sort of tells you your altitude above local sea level, whereas the aircraft GPS tells you its altitude above let me get this right, a projected ellipsoid, which is sort of like a perfectly smooth version of the Earth. And the Earth is really craggy and bumpy and has some differences. So it ends up, you sort of have to correct for this. So this is one gotcha, which messes up. If you're ever going to start doing weird geo-based things for figuring out where you are and figuring out where to point your camera, doing this autonomously, just Google ellipsoids and GPS. Again, this really only mattered for these takeoffs and landings, where 50 meters plus or minus would make a big difference. For your house, these airplanes are at 2 or 3 miles up, so 50 feet or 50 meters doesn't really have too big a difference. Last one on positions, and this is sort of the challenge of how you find north. And the challenge is just doing it very accurately, because for when you're zooming in, and we'll get into some of the camera details, you end up with a frame of view of roughly like 1 or 2 degrees. So if your compass only gives you 5 degrees of accuracy, it gets a bit trickier. So one way to do this is what we did instead is we found a local landmark, radio antennas or, a building. And using that, we were able to figure out, we pointed the camera at where it should be. It was off by a bit, and then we just physically moved the camera so it was actually pointing correctly at where that landmark is. So if your sort of the calibration system you're using isn't accurate enough, this is like a good hack you can use, is tell the camera where it should be pointing based upon your math, and then physically move the camera to be there too. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause. I've been talking for a lot. Are there any questions coming in on the chat, or do you guys have any questions? I'll get to the photos in a second, I promise.
I think the question that everybody's asking is afraid to write in the chat, like, how did you come up with the idea in the first place?
Oh, yeah. So honestly, half of it is like I collect junk. Like I find like I can't let good technology go in the trash bin. So it really is like, man, I have this camera. Let's see.
Started with a camera.
Yeah, so it started with the camera. It started at our offices where I was working were right near the airport for Reagan National Airport. So it's right along the river, and they were coming in at a nice approach. So I was like, oh man, they're always flying by. I'm always curious what they are. So that's what really kicked it off. Yeah, so I have to stay away from like swap meets or, anything where there's just interesting technology that shouldn't hit the rubbish bin. But I'm working on controlling that urge.
Because I was just thinking there is so many points where I could see, I was thinking, oh, this like crowdsourcing, were you a part of this community in the first place and then it came from there? Or it's like, like this Twitter bots were inspired by these Twitter bots, or so these all came afterwards. It started with a camera that you found. Where did you actually find it?
And didn't want to throw away. It was like, yeah, it's not a healthy approach to project selection, I don't think, but it does end up with some interesting collaborations.
Well, we're happy that you found a camera, and we'll let you go ahead with the rest of the presentation.
Okay,
in the meantime, everybody feel free to write your questions in the chat, and we'll bring them to Luke for you. Thanks.
Great. And so one sort of final thing on just sort of figuring out the math behind, how to photograph and what to photograph is sort of, as you saw on the map, there are lots of aircraft around, and you're getting a lot of information in, especially if you have something that can see like 100 miles away. So you want to come up with some sort of system for prioritization. So this is almost like the robotic photographer brain of figuring out what should I point my camera at? There's a bunch of different subjects out there. Which is going to make the best photo at this time? And so you can start with some very basic things, such as how far away is the aircraft? A lot of times it's way too far away. Even with a good zoom, you couldn't catch it. In another case, a lot of times, let me just switch back quick to this one. So this, you can see, if I zoom in here, you see this, and this would be an example of some of the data I got, like all of these aircraft right here. That's because it's an airport, and they're all on the ground and they're parked. So they make a horrible photograph. And even though they're really close to my house, distance-wise, they're on the ground and they're not flying. And there's no way I could actually get a photograph of them. So there's a number of things like that you sort of have to take into consideration. Another big one for me, because I live in a little patio, I have a little patio out back, and there's a lot of buildings around me, is just things on the ground which can sort of block the view of things flying by. And one of the final things also is we ought to build in features too for if there's really annoying aircraft, this sort of going around in a circle. We had over our house, just someone, flying back and forth for the city, taking LiDAR images or something like that. So it spent the whole day focusing on that. So just a way to ignore aircraft too, that might be, in essence, photo bombing what you're trying to do. So this is just a way to ignore the photo bombers. But as you go through this, you can come up with more and more complex rules to get the more interesting shots and making sure you're not missing interesting aircraft. I won't dive too much into this, but this is in short was sort of like the software view of how this worked. So I was running the PyAware software, just sort of straight off the shelf, and that gives you the data about all the variable aircraft. It's sort of in a weird format. So what I have is that I wrote a small program. It's a tracker program. It pulls in, it figures out which aircraft to track based on that prioritization, and then figures out where to point the camera. And then it passes this off in a nice sort of standard message format to a camera pointer. And that is just a little program that runs and figures out where to point the camera. And it uses the different APIs for each of the cameras. So it'll work with a number of different types of cameras. And let's go back here and show you, if you're interested in this code, it's all up here. So in my old job, I was at a lab for one of a VC firm, and we were able to put this out into public source. So the underlying software that I was working on is called SkyScan, and just Google GitHub SkyScan. You can pull this up. I'll drop some stuff in the chat after. And this has everything you need to sort of get up and running. And this part of the software goes and takes the photos and saves it locally onto your hard drive. The SkyBot part I wrote puts it onto the website and puts it onto Twitter. So I wrote both of these. I can talk about that at the end. There's also, we included some designs in here if you want to build a portable version of this too. So this is how we brought it close to the airport. Versus over there, that thing is more weatherproof and roof mountable, but it's heavy and it doesn't work with a battery. So a little bit on the software. So let's get to taking photos. That's why we're all here. So these are the two cameras I've really been playing around with. And they're two different styles. I'll go over their pluses and minuses. The first one is, this is sort of like the standard security camera. And I'm realizing for most people, you usually see that one twisted the other way up. So you have sort of that glass dome looking down on you. My innovation was just flipping it upside down, so it's pointing at the sky. And it's able to really get a full view of the sky, and the better cameras are able to turn in a full circle. So it can just sort of loop around and catch things there. And I think Axis is a nice Swedish company. They make really good gear, and they have a nice API that's really easy to program and essentially automate where the camera's pointing. So if you're looking at doing sort of any other interesting tech photography art projects, it's a pretty easy way to have sort of a remote controlled camera. And the image quality is pretty good, but unfortunately, I'll get same thing with the other camera. They don't give you that much control, like for just setting the aperture or shutter speed or things like that. Generally, they'll give you a range, or you're stuck putting some of those into sort of an automatic mode, because they're really supposed to get an okay photo in almost every condition versus a good photo in sort of select conditions. So that's one of the drawbacks. So originally started out with that style of camera, and then moved to this positioning camera, which you can see behind me. And the difference between that is this one sort of is almost more like a robot arm, which moves a camera around, versus the other system is more compact and a lot smaller. The plus side is the positioning camera is very weatherproof. It's designed to operate like that. So it's designed to be able to operate flipped upside down. Those dome cameras, they actually have warnings not to tip it upside down. And it's really just because it may not be as weatherproof that way. As you can see, there's just vent holes in there and other things where water can collect. So if you're going to leave it outside, that second style of camera might be a bit better. But, definitely lots of experimentation. And also just go on eBay and check. That's where I got all of this. eBay is great because you can just get, these used cameras. They generally work pretty well, and you'll save a lot of money. So these, for when you're looking between these, here are some of the specifications that matter. For this type of work, having a really good zoom lens is important. And in a lot of cases, you can't, so I'm used to more 35 millimeter photography. And, if you're just looking and saying, like, 150 millimeter lens, it's not the equivalent with security cameras just because they have a smaller sensor in there. So instead, it's probably better to look at field of view and just think of that as, of a 360-degree sphere, how much of that sphere would the camera capture? So the one behind me is I think a 30x zoom, and I think it did a 1 degree by a 1.5 or 1.8 degree zoom when it was fully zoomed in. The other side of that equation is the resolution of the sensor. And for most of the modern cameras, they're at least 1080p. They really equate back to video format resolution, but most of them are 1080. And then some of the more expensive, if you have lots of money, you can get a 4K sensor. And there's going to be some trade-offs on, with the actual optics versus the resolution, and at a full zoom, are you actually getting better images from those pixels? So unfortunately, there's not much, camera review sites out there for security cameras and their image quality, but you can maybe try to get some samples and see how that works. It may be better to get an older camera with a better zoom than a newer one with 4K. And then some of the other stuff just around, making sure it can actually accurately position the camera. Some of them aren't really designed for, high accuracy. So if you're trying to save money, figuring out how to save that money could get a little tricky. And then one of the other nice things is just going for power over Ethernet. So you just have one cable to connect, and it gives the data and the power. So where we do that, let me just go quickly into some of the raw images that, just an example of some of the raw images that get dumped. And so in the spirit of camera walking, or screen walking, let me go. So this is just an example for like a one-day capture. This was from December 24th. I just copied off the Raspberry Pi all of the different planes it captured, and it sorts it by the aircraft model number. I'll just point out, you get weird things. This was probably a foreign registered aircraft, because you notice it's Boeing company, Boeing 777. So both the name was weird and then the model number was weird too. But if we just pull up, and I'll point out, so the camera was in my backyard and it's going essentially from one field of view to the other side. So we'll start out with the camera essentially with the aircraft being out of frame. And then if you sort of flip through the different images as the camera gets higher, oh, this one was covered by cloud. So that's one of the challenges you get, is a lot of these images, you could have a cloudy day and you actually don't get to see the aircraft. So let me just see if there's a better one. So if you notice by time, that was about 1:18. So I find one maybe earlier in the day. Let me see if I can show you some pictures of actual aircraft. So this is an example of what's sort of coming raw off the camera. And this is at the maximum zoom for the camera I had. So you notice the framing isn't perfect for all these shots. Like it doesn't get it dead center. Like sometimes it'll be a little above and a little below. And that's because just positioning it's accurately is really challenging, and take into account sort of the speed it takes for the camera head to move and things like that. And you'll just notice there's like maybe a telephone wire going through the back of my yard. So sometimes getting occlusions and other things like that. So we'll get into like solutions for that in a second. And then other times you get it where it's just sort of cut off to the side. So getting this to work well is still a work in progress. But if you take a lot of photos, then some of them will turn out okay. And so just, there's two different ways to interface to some of these security cameras. There's the one for the Axis, and that's the dome camera, and they sort of have their own proprietary API. And then there's also this open standard called, I don't know how to pronounce it, OnVIF maybe, or something like that. So if you're looking on eBay and you see a camera that supports OnVIF, it's pretty easy to work with and has a standard interface. So it'll let you work with a bunch of the software and libraries out there. Okay, here. So this is, I'm going to sort of walk through an example of the processing pipeline that got it from these raw images out to what's the SkyBot website. Oh, yeah, sort of went through all of that. The one note I'll put out there is when you put your camera somewhere, make sure there's a way to actually get to clean the lens. You know, when things like pollen season hit and you put this up on your roof, if you don't clean it, everything just has a yellow haze to it. So having access to the camera is probably pretty important. This camera here, since it has a much smaller lens, it doesn't collect much pollen. It's more those big dome cameras, which just get fingerprints and pollen and everything all over them. So, okay, we'll dive into processing and sharing. This is how it went from those raw images up to something that was on the website and then out onto Twitter. So I'll sort of just step through these these steps, and I won't bore you with the code because it's all really messy and not commented, but happy if anyone wants to dive into this, you know, shoot me the link and I'll walk you through some of the code and the steps if you want to build your own Twitter bot or website for trying to, you know, publish images either from, you know, a setup like this or sort of any autonomous camera project. But the basic steps are sort of detecting where that aircraft is, making a thumbnail out of it to share it, and then just doing some basic processing of the image too. So one of the first steps is just doing some basic auto levels to the camera. This is actually probably not the best example because it's actually pretty clear, but in some of those photos where you had a lot of clouds or haze in the sky, just hitting it with, you know, an auto level on the contrast really helps, you know, bring out the actual aircraft detail. You could do a lot fancier things. This, I was just using some simple Python libraries. So it does an okay job. Handling some sort of white balance in there too is probably a good idea, especially because the security camera white balance isn't great. And you'll get very different light color, you know, if it's towards the beginning of the day or the end of the day. So you'd want to hopefully, you know, try to balance that out, or, you know, make sure you keep it if it's something, you know, airplane at the sunset does look pretty cool. So this is, you know, after hitting it with a basic just auto leveling, you'll see it makes the aircraft pop out a lot more because it's getting rid of sort of that low contrast from the haze. And so this is sort of you could probably get away with not doing this step, but it's actually pretty important because as you saw, there's a lot of pictures where it takes a picture of a building or it's cloudy out and there's no airplane, you're taking pictures of clouds. So being able to figure out which of the photos actually have aircraft in them versus which ones are everything else is pretty important. Otherwise, you're forcing everyone to go to your website to sort through all this. So what I did is I just set up a pretty simple machine learning model that can detect aircraft. I work at Microsoft right now, so I have some free credit, which was one of the things that also spurred me on to build this website. Was I had free credits to use each month, so I wanted to make a cool website. They have a tool called Azure Custom Vision, and what you do is you just upload a bunch of photos, and then you just draw boxes around the things you want to detect, and then it gives you a nice detector. It will, you know, spit back if it detects that object in it, and then also sort of the bounding boxes of where that is. But back in that Skyscan code, I also wrote up a Jupyter notebook and a TensorFlow type application for doing this too. So if you just have, you know, a computer with a GPU in it and you want to get, you know, really hands-on, that's something you can do. So did all that, you get, you sort of build a data set of, you know, here's some examples of these aircrafts I want to detect. Then you train a model to detect them. And one of the key things to do this, and I learned this the hard way, is just also make sure you include lots of non-plane examples. So it turns out that for the computer, which is sort of dumb, you know, air conditioners can sort of look like airplanes. So you get some pictures of air conditioners sneaking into your website, which no one really wants. But you can catch these sorts of mistakes, feed them back into your algorithm, and train a better model. So this actually, I just sort of hand recreated this, but this is sort of an example of what it would do. It would find that bounding box of where the aircraft is in the image, or if there's none there, it would say there's no aircraft here. Don't bother with this image. And then it adds some padding around that and creates a thumbnail. So with all that, all those thumbnails and sort of the information associated with the airplane get uploaded from my local computer. All that processing happens actually in the cloud. Every time the camera captures a new image, it sends it to the cloud. It detects if there's, does the auto leveling, it detects if there's aircraft, and then it puts it together in this website. So let me just walk you through this real quick. There's many things I want to do with it still, but here we are. I'll sort of circle back to the very end on why they sort of stopped and the images got crappy, because that was a fun thing to diagnose. But generally what this does is, this website is just sort of those infinite scrollers, and it's at skybot.cam. And you can see the different aircraft which have flown by. And you can do a little drop down and you can look at some of the information it pulled up from either that FAA data source or somewhere else. And you can also see, Wilmington Trust Company trustee. This is an example of, one of those trustee owned aircraft. You can see here's one for an LLC called Caro Jake. So, it tries to meld together sort of that information about the aircraft with the photos of it. If you click on the aircraft, you can see all the different images, the thumbnails of the different images that were captured of it. You can see clearly the aim from the camera system was a little off because, we're getting it cut off here. So that's one area I have to work on tuning a bit better. But that gives you all of that. In the future, what I'd like to do is be able to, this is all stored in sort of a database, be able to query, by airplane owner or by airplane type and bring up different photos for each of those. You could think about other interesting ways of querying this together. If you had multiple people with cameras like this, you could sort of do taking photos of an airplane, similar to how they have that crowdsourced map of just pulling this information. You could take photos of an aircraft as it traveled across country. I don't know what that would be useful for, but you could do it. So that's sort of the basics on the SkyBot website. It's all pretty simple, but you notice I did a little experiments too, and just seeing what it looked like at night. You get some really wild photos because of the long exposure time, and the camera itself is moving. So you have a combination of the camera moving, the airplane moving, and you usually just get the blinking lights on the bottom of the airplane, but you end up with these really fun abstract things. The really impressive thing is that, you do get some stars. Somehow the airplane detection algorithm was able to figure out there's an airplane here. So sometimes these ML models can actually be better at detecting things than humans, or maybe a stop clock gets things right every now and then too. So who knows? But you notice right around April 1st, it's tracking and pointing at something, but there's actually no airplane there and it's really not zoomed in. So it turns out that unfortunately SkyBot died a horrible death. I'll show you some examples. I'll just show you the camera module I pulled out. It looks like the zoom motor died, and I think it was because I programmed that API incorrectly, and it was setting the zoom setting every time it moved the camera. And while the motors to move the camera, I think, were probably really reliable, the zoom motor may not have been as beefy, and it unfortunately bit the dust. We just have a few more minutes left, I think, so I just want to get to, so that's the basics. We also have the Twitter bot, which sends out tweets each time it sees a new airplane, and makes this, a little more socially media accessible. So sometimes I like just watching this actually sometimes just to see if interesting aircraft go by, and then you can easily hit retweet and share it with people. This one's fun though. Turns out, though, this is an example of where my airplane detecting algorithm, the machine learning model, went horribly wrong. It accidentally captured a picture of a bird. The model thought the bird was a plane, and then the Twitter bot just posted that. So this is just a great example of when you want to actually feed in examples of things that are not planes, if you're going to do sort of any automated photography, photo processing, just to make sure you're not tweeting pictures of birds. So that's how I built a camera that could automatically photograph airplanes as they fly by. And now I'm just going to take one small side detour on how I took some of those photos and then made essentially another robot draw a sketch of them, and then made another robot physically draw a sketch of them. So let's go down this wild rabbit hole. So this is a fun sort of machine learning model out there, and I don't fully understand how it works. You can go to the link there. It has a pretty good video explaining it. But the long and short of it is it's able to do different levels of abstraction and draw sketches of objects. It works best when the object is sort of alone and highlighted. So either it has a white background or, it's just a drawing of something. And it's named after Picasso. Oh, I think I totally spelled that wrong. No, Clip Passo. So the algorithm, the general model it's using is called Clip, and then it mixed in Picasso in there. So you have Clip Passo, and you can sort of see like some of, it does work maybe in a similar style of him, of just how can you get as minimal as possible. And you can select the number of lines you allow for the model to use when coming up with these drawings. So I did this for one of my airplane photos. It turns out I didn't need to do this, but I took the aircraft photo, and then I just did a light masking around it so I'd get rid of the sky. Turns out I could have just used the sky. It works fine either way. And this is the output it gave me when I did it for, I think this was 6 lines. And it gives you just an SVG file, which is a series of lines. And you can, bring this into, Illustrator or one of those other sort of vector art programs. And you can use different brush strokes and things along those lines. So if you wanted to make it like look more like a watercolor, you could do that. But I have one of the other weird gadgets I have is a pen plotter. And this is essentially a robot arm that will take in sort of that line art and go and draw a picture. So it takes a program and makes you physical real art. So this is an example of a little video of it just going around drawing. It's very soothing to watch, and came up with an okay drawing of an airplane, but it was almost a full circle of machine taking picture of airplane and then having another computer program turn this into art and then having something physically go and draw the art. One of my friends at work actually took this and then went with a laser cutter and then sketched this out on a piece of wood too. So you could go in many different mediums with sort of those files. So just really quick on some of the behind the scenes construction photos, I don't want to make anyone think I actually know what I'm doing. A lot of this was just sort of iterative experimentation. The first time, I just sort of bolted this to a piece of wood on my picnic table out back. And it sort of tilted over in different directions and back to like accuracy. Since the wood wasn't really solid, it sort of went all over the place. So I went on eBay, I got a little better of a stand, bolted that to wood a little more securely. So I had a nice solid base. And then I had it out there for a bit and it actually worked pretty well. It snowed and I was able to sort of shake off the snow and have it up and running. So, again, just encourage people to go out and tinker and try stuff because it doesn't have to be perfect to get started either. I want to let people know that, you can hack stuff together, bolt it together and still get something that works pretty good. So that was the end of my slides. Totally open for questions. Happy to share, dive into other things or go where people are interested.
Thank you so much. Look, this was a wild ride.
Excellent.
Thank you so much.
You've been extremely generous in sharing all of these details, both technically, but also, like in terms of the wider ideas behind it, as we were discussing right before, like there's so many layers behind this project. And I really love also like your approach to things, like trying, starting from somewhere and going somewhere completely different, and who knows where you're going to go next. I have a question from Sheng Yu, who asked, I'd like to know if you are in the open source intelligence community and if you have any thought on the way OSINT is making use of the surplus of information available and how it is changing journalism and photography.
Yeah.
Very specific.
No, that's a great question. So me personally, I'm not really. I'm more like a consumer of it. I love following Twitter and sort of, seeing all the sort of developments in that space. I'm definitely interested in seeing how new data sources could sort of go into the OSINT community and sort of drive new types of journalism. Just one example, not related to this, but when Russia sort of initially launched their first offensive in the Ukraine, like one of the first things I saw on Twitter was someone noticed on Google Maps, there was like a 4-hour traffic jam showing up on one of the roads. So just looking at how traffic data could be a tool for data journalism and OSINT and using that as a data source is just sort of fascinating. So definitely interested in like how new data sources can, provide new reporting and sort of sources of intelligence. I haven't honestly figured out any real reporting or data value for taking pictures of airplanes, other than I'm an airplane nerd. But if there is one, definitely curious in hearing from people and how adding photos in addition to just sort of the general sort of ADSB information could be useful.
So just a general maybe explanation for those who are not aware. OSINT.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Open source intelligence. So it's just sort of the looking at publicly available sources of information as a way to sort of gain intelligence or something like that. It's sort of is it portmanteau or some sort of formal word for that is sort of combining all those things together. But and a little different, it sometimes gets confusing because it's not open source software. It's sort of openly available sources of information and using those as a way to, as a sort of like an original information source.
And there's another question on the chat here on Zoom. I think that the previous one was coming from Twitch, but here on Zoom, Peter is asking, am I right that the initial object tracking depends on radio signals? If so, can you track any object that emits a radio signal, e.g. a mobile telephone?
Yeah, no, so it probably depends on two things. It depends on having that radio broadcast, but what makes this possible is all of those airplanes are broadcasting their location. So you have, each aircraft essentially saying, here I am, I'm here and this is where I am. You couldn't really do that with cell phones because figuring out like which signal is coming from where is probably really tricky, but they don't really broadcast their location. If you wanted to get creative though, if like you're doing some extreme sport or some, I don't know, and you wanted a camera to follow you for some reason, you could maybe build a little app on your phone that, shared your location to a camera like this and had it point at you as you walk through a crowd, or you're on a fancy yacht and you want, pictures of you on a yacht from remote control. So you could adapt this to be sort of like an automatic photographer type system for someone who wanted to have photos taken of them as they do something cool.
I was also wondering, I mean, just seeing you only shared one of the folders with the photos that the camera took over a day. And we could see already dozens, if not hundreds of images on that only one folder. So like, what's the scale of project and how many photographs have you taken? And also, if you consider this some sort of like a data set of a visual data set that you have built, because you mentioned also machine learning processes, and I was thinking that this could be also a quite valuable visual data sets on planes. And I'm not sure if you have like considered it that way.
Yeah, no, totally. That's a great point. I actually meant to put a few slides in on that. So yeah, no, that is, you end up with a ton of photos. And sometimes they're of airplanes, sometimes they're of clouds, and sometimes they're of buildings. But like in a single day, you probably get, it depends on your location. I had maybe 30 or 40 different aircraft flying overhead. And for each of those, you get maybe, 30 photos of taking one photo a second. So you end up with a decent data set in a day. And with that, so you get a decent number of photos. It does turn into a really interesting data set because you're enriching for each photo, you get the aircraft make and model and manufacturer and the number of engines. So let me just go share. One of the things I had worked on was just some machine learning scripts back to here, essentially put together a small, two things at once, brain's not working, way to take those images and turn them into a labeled plane data set. So we did a little research here, but there might be a paper out there I can try to find. But essentially, you could start building a data set that would let you train a machine learning model to identify the aircraft models. So being able to say, is this a Boeing 737 or an Airbus 320? And being able to tell those two different types of planes apart. You get into some really interesting questions because you don't have that much variety in angle of its look and what it's actually learning. Maybe it's learning the paint scheme because one aircraft is always painted yellow and the other's painted red. So maybe it's not learning the model. So there's a lot of interesting data quality questions, but you can start building that data set and asking.
So that way we could even identify the plane, the model, without using the radar, just having the camera pointing out to the sky, like potentially, I guess, no?
Yeah. If that was the plan and the goal, I think it would definitely work well for things like, is this, I'm gonna get the names wrong, like a Pleiades 12 or something, which is like a single propeller airplane versus, a double engine Boeing. And so you can probably do it for things that are, but whether you can be really fine, how fine grained you can get, I think is a really interesting question to learn more about, but I think you could get there down the road.
So I'm not sure, I'm just
I have
checking
one
on
more
the chat.
question, a question that maybe is a bit on the side of the topic, but so look, you have to understand that ScreenWalk is also a personal way for being wire for me and John to look at other people's computers. So you have 26,000 unread emails. How do you sleep at night?
Isn't that horrible? Yeah. Like
I can't see at the bottom of the screen. It gave me a lot of anxiety.
Yeah. I'm sure that's probably made someone cringe and just completely turn off their feed.
No, jokes aside, actually my question was about the future of SkyBot. We've seen the tragic death of SkyBot, and now we're all worried about, especially after the last artistic experiments at night, which were really promising, and they were kind of like going in a very interesting direction, and that was too much, maybe.
Yeah, no, so hopefully I can find a replacement. So this is the camera module. Unfortunately, it's from Hitachi, and they stopped this whole line of business. So hopefully I can find one on Twitter, or no, I mean eBay, to replace it. But if not, I'll have to go, I don't know, start from ground zero. I do want to get it back up and running. Definitely let me know if you're, some wealthy company that wants to sponsor some weird artistic project. Totally happy to slap some stickers on this or do some branding. But otherwise, I'll just go find some weird used gear and try to get something up and running again, because I miss being able to see all the planes flying by.
You do have like a last question asking about if the number of passengers on the planes are made public. If there's any way to know about that, because it will be a good way to track the so-called ghost flights, the flights that run with no passengers or almost no passengers, in order not to lose their spot, for the islands.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So in the data I've found, I haven't seen that. You do get how big an aircraft it is. So that would be you'd have to find some other way of figuring that out, probably, unless there's some sort of visual clue, like maybe you get bigger contrails, or or it's going a little slower if it's so. Unfortunately, there probably isn't a way to answer that. But the FAA data does give you how many, like the class of it, so you get the rough number of passengers it could hold. So you could start doing something maybe around what's the carbon offset of this aircraft versus number of passengers. So you'd have a business jet where it holds 7 people and it has this, burning this per person is this much carbon versus, a passenger airplane. So you could do some interesting, environmental impact data maybe, but unfortunately the ghost size is tough.
That would be a really interesting way also to evolve the SkyBot and to try to identify to connect the SkyBot with all these other openly available data sets on things like passengers, and other issues. So, I mean, we've been more than an hour now here. I guess that if there's no more questions, maybe we can wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Luke. It's been really interesting to learn about SkyBot and to share with you this morning in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, thanks a lot as well from my side. Also, thanks to everybody who joined here and on Twitch, and everybody who's watching this on YouTube in the future. We're back in 2 weeks with Artist Collective Fragmenting and a live urban performance that I believe will also use antennas. So we're back in the exploration of electromagnetic waves in this case, and how they will turn that into visual and sonic data. So stay with us. We'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.